I'm taking this opportunity to share with you an overview of the book I edited, and I was part of a project back in 2008. It was a study on 13 developing countries, 8 in Asia and 5 in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the project looked into the trade, development, poverty linkages in those countries. So this is the cover of the book. It was published in 2 volumes. The first volume looked at into the country case studies, and the second volume looked at the sectoral case studies in those countries. A bit background, the development strategy for growth, employment, and poverty reduction in the developing countries. So we know that the countries, many of these countries went for self-sufficiency. And there was a dependence on foreign aid and eventually a campaign for trade, not aid. But there has been a shift from inward-looking policy, and actively these countries engaged in multilateral trade negotiation. Unilateral liberalization and multilateral trade negotiation promised a new era for growth and poverty reduction in many of these countries. However, this 3DB project suggests that trade and development experiences are far from being similar, so diverse that the general relationship is a subject of regular empirical scrutiny. So these are the 13 countries, 8 from Asia: Bangladesh, Cambodia, China, India, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam, and 5 from Sub-Saharan Africa. They were Kenya, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. And there's a set of diverse countries, diverse in terms of their large or small countries, high growth and erratic growth performance, large and low export response, commodity, many of these countries exporting primary or manufacturing commodities. And diversity offers invaluable insights into TDP, trade development poverty linkages. Just to give you an idea about how diverse these countries are, in fact, you can see in terms of GDP size, per capita GNI, and in terms of population size, there are marked differences among these countries. Also in terms of export share, in terms of size of export, share in export, in terms of manufacturing export, in total export, in terms of agricultural GDP share, and also in terms of base year poverty share, you can see there are marked differences in those countries. Now we know that there are the theoretical insights in terms of TDP linkages. In fact, it is far from being conclusive. There are inconclusive theoretical arguments in terms of static gains from trade. There are static gains from trade arguments. Also, there are some arguments for dynamic gains leading to higher growth. And also, new growth theories, in fact, they have provided some ambiguous linkages, insights into trade TDP linkages. But also in terms of empirical evidence, it's also very much inconclusive, and powerful evidence found to be not credible. I think one of the major problems is identifying countries as open and closed is difficult and often flawed. Just consider export GDP ratio. I have shown you earlier that Vietnam has got a 70% export GDP ratio, and in terms of that indicator, you may find that it's a very open country, but based on other indicators like tariff and total trade GDP ratio, you may find that other countries may be more open than Vietnam. So there are problems in using the indicators of openness. And also there are many literature, we know that empirical evidence are far from being conclusive, and a very recent work by UNCTAD where they looked into the export load growth, and they came up with the argument that the export load growth is misleading. And in fact, the argument was that countries that grow fast tend to experience rising export GDP ratios. And also trade poverty direct relationship is complex. And in terms of exposed econometric evidence, I just cite one example from China. That study was done by Ravilion in 2006. And there was a striking econometric evidence from China that between 1981 and 2001, China's trade GDP ratio increased from 15% to 45%, whereas and the same period, poverty incidence fell from 52% to 7%. And Ravilion found that there's no statistical relationship between these two indicators. So the experience of the TDP project countries, I have mentioned to you the 13 countries. There are strong trade controls in the immediate post-independence period. Started opening up with the BWI support. Vietnam and China, liberation initiative mainly was domestically led. And liberation led to, in all these countries, a decline in the quantitative restriction, rationalization and diminution of import tariffs, relaxation of foreign exchange controls, privatization of SOEs, generous promotional measures for exports. Now just want to give you some very quick overview of the results. Just take a look at this graph. This line is the average growth, this is the average GDP growth and the vertical axis and the average tariff in 2001. And this line is the average growth of developing countries, and this line is the average tariff of developing countries. You may find there very, not very, conclusive, relationship between these two indicators. Also, more strikingly, that Bangladesh and India almost having a similar average rate of growth during that period, but their tariff rates were much higher in India than Bangladesh. And also compare Kenya and Vietnam, almost having the similar average rate of tariff in that period, but Vietnam's growth experience was much higher than Kenya. In terms of growth and poverty, also there's a positive relation in terms of average GDP growth and reduction in poverty, but also the country experience are very, very diverse. Take the example of Bangladesh and Cambodia. Having the almost similar rate of poverty reduction, Bangladesh could manage that reduction in poverty with a lower GDP growth, and Cambodia was having a higher GDP growth. But between Bangladesh and India, with having a similar, almost similar GDP growth, India could achieve a higher reduction in poverty than Bangladesh. And similar observation is you can compare between Vietnam and Cambodia. With having the similar average GDP growth, Vietnam could achieve a high reduction in poverty. So we also, during this, for the periods under consideration, we also calculate the growth illustrated poverty, and it appeared that India is having the highest growth rate of growth illustrated poverty among these 13 countries, followed by Vietnam and Nepal. And Kenya were having the very lowest growth illustrated poverty. Now, what are the lessons we learned from these TDP country studies? The first lesson was that ownership of the policy regime is very important, and homegrown initiative, in fact, it worked well, and rather than anything which were imposed from outside. Export response to liberation, the one important lesson was that whether removing anti-export bias was enough. Because of the trade liberation, there have been reduction in anti-export bias. The major problem was that that reduction in anti-export bias, the benefit of that reduction in anti-export bias was enjoyed by only few export-oriented sectors. So I think, take the example of Bangladesh, and take the example of Nepal, take the example of Cambodia, the export basket is still very concentrated. So I think these are one of the lessons, important lessons to draw. Initial distribution endowments, China and Vietnam, they are very good examples, but can the experience of Vietnam and China be replicated elsewhere? This is a big question. Easy reforms versus critical reforms. I think the areas institutional reforms and capacity came very important. The role of agriculture in the wake of the crisis of the food price hike and poverty and hunger. I think despite the need for diversification, in fact, much more emphasis in the manufacturing sector, there's a need for a dynamic agricultural sector in those countries. Priority for future reforms may not be the mere tariff cuts, but more fundamental in nature. Many of these countries, in fact, they went for tariff cuts, and which is easy in nature because you can just cut your tariff. But more fundamental reforms are in the areas of institutions, which many of these countries they really overlooked. Supply capacity and trade barriers. The common findings is that trade reforms do not generate supply side capacity automatically. So you need to invest on infrastructural facilities and other areas. And there's a need for, of course, a policy space and a better use of it. In conclusion, the trade policy is a fundamental component of development strategies. Wide deviations from the general liberation and economic prosperity, and it's found that same set of policies produces dramatically different results in different countries. Country cases exhibit that the same size fits all philosophy has failed to deliver. Country cases show the need for learning from others' experiences, but blind experiences may not work. The orthodox route to dealing with development problems needs to be replaced with heterodox approaches. It requires analytical policy regimes capable of identifying structural weaknesses. In the absence of proactive initiatives, growth could bypass the poor. And there is also need to address the problems of social and political instabilities and also bad governance in these countries. And finally, a development-friendly international trade regime is important in promoting trade development and poverty linkages in poor countries. Thank you very much for your kind attention.